So if you've clicked on this video, you're probably a beginner photographer or videographer looking to get their very first camera. And with the insane amount of options we have nowadays, you're probably wondering which one is right for you across the dozens of different brands and the hundreds of different models, especially all of the ones that have come out this year. Well, this video is the third video in my beginner's guide series, and in it, we're going to demystify and break down all of the little considerations you might have to make when it comes to deciding what to buy for your very first camera or your first couple of cameras even. Now, this video is for beginners, people new to photography and videography. So if you're an experienced hybrid shooter and you have an opinion, then feel free to jump into the comments below and help out your fellow creatives and provide your own suggestions on the content in this video. Perhaps the two biggest things to consider when it comes to selecting the right camera for you are: what is it going to be used for, and how much budget do you have? From there, other important, but in my opinion, definitely less important things to think about are things like sensor size and image quality and build and brand, amongst other things. We'll cover all of those things in a moment, but before we get started, this video doesn't have a sponsor, but it is supported by the thousands of you wonderful people who get value out of all of my courses, prints, presets, and ebooks over at patk.com. So thank you so much for all of the continued support, and it is because of you that I can continue to make free videos just like this one. Now, in today's world, we have people who only want to do photography. We have people who only want to do videography. We have content creators. We have hybrid shooters. The opportunity for the lines to be blurred between photo and video are more accessible than ever. And even if you originally got into all of this because you only wanted to do photography or only wanted to do videography, then I would at least encourage you to have your mind open, the possibility of learning both of these skills on the horizon, because knowing both is a tremendously valuable skill set in today's world. Again, that might not be on the cards for you right now, but it might be something that you factor into your decision-making process when it comes to selecting your very first camera. Do you want your camera to be a stills first camera with video as an afterthought? Or do you want a video first camera with stills as an afterthought, right? Or do you want something that excels at both equally and is a true hybrid camera? Thinking about this first and foremost is a really great idea, not only just to frame the rest of the video, but also to just start thinking for yourself now, because you're probably going to be doing a lot of growing in the very near future. And in my opinion, especially with the amounts that cameras cost nowadays, and we'll get to that in a future section, I think it's a great idea to select a camera with a little bit more headroom in terms of skill so that you can then grow into it. Now, in addition to that, there's probably a category of photography or videography that initially drew you in. For me, when I first got started, it was all about street photography. But you might be drawn to travel photography or portraiture or landscape photography. Or you might be drawn to cinematography or filmmaking or documentary or vlogging or YouTube, and so on and so on. Again, this is one of the things that I want to address at the start of the video as your frame of reference for the rest of the video, because different use cases have different requirements to consider. Things like a small lightweight camera are great for things like travel and street photography and vlogging and YouTube, at the sacrifice of, say, image quality or performance perhaps. On the flip side, a bigger, heavier, more expensive camera that can change lenses might be great for things like landscapes or filmmaking or at home in a YouTube setup because of their increased quality and functionality. Just things to consider to frame the rest of the video, and we'll dive into the specifics as we move on a little bit further. Now, the second most important thing here is budget. Realistically speaking, most people start photography or videography as a hobby. And as such, usually most people can't really justify spending that much on a camera. And most budget to, I would say, mid-range cameras are around under 1,000 USD, with some really good value options out there, like the Sony ZV-1F at around 400 USD, or the Sony A6400 for around 700 USD. Now, typically cameras with the ability to change lenses are going to be the more expensive options, right? These cameras are called interchangeable lens cameras. And it is these cameras that are typically the ones that have a little bit more headroom for you to grow into because of the vast range of different lenses you can buy and different add-ons that are available. And you can keep on upgrading your experience, as well as the fact that, typically these bodies usually, but not always, have more functionality and features than their counterparts, which are the fixed lens cameras. Fixed lens cameras, as the name implies, are ones where you can't remove the lens. Usually these are going to be your compact style of cameras like this one, which offer decent performance and excellent portability at the sacrifice of, not being able to change your lenses. Now, it is worth noting at this point that when you're first starting out with photography or videography, spending a lot of money on the latest and greatest camera gear isn't going to make you a better photographer or videographer. The thing is, whether you're using your phone, a little compact camera like this one, an APS-C size camera like this one, or a full frame camera like this one, all of these different devices have decent performance and are able to produce great results in the right hands. And a good photographer will be able to create stunning results with any one of these cameras. This RX100, for example, is a compact camera with a fixed lens, and many people think it's a beginner or a mid-tier camera because of its size and its appearance, but I keep this one around with me almost every single day, and it's produced some of my favorite portfolio level images that you can't tell are shot on this little pea shooter. My point here is that there is a craft and an art to photography and videography, and at the start of your journey, regardless of how much you spend, it will take you quite a while to reach the ceiling of any one of these devices at any of these price points, really. So, if photography or videography isn't yet a full-time thing for you and you don't know if you're serious about it, then it might be a better idea to get something cheap to start with and see if you enjoy the process and then take it from there. And that actually brings me to my next point about budget, which is that the second-hand camera market is such a great place to get your very first camera. And it's kind of like when you start to drive and you have your first car, the best car to learn on is a second-hand one rather than buying a brand new one off the showroom floor, because there's just so much learning that's going to be going on in the first stages that you're probably going to damage it, burn the clutch, nick the sides, put it in weird situations that you would have never encountered before, abuse certain parts of it without even knowing, and so on and so on and so on. And if you're doing it right, hopefully you're using your very first camera so much that you can start to see some level of wear and tear, and those marks are going to be the signal that you've put the time in, and it's going to be the thing that makes your new camera purchase all the more sweeter once you've learned how to use all of the functions properly and you've grown into the craft and the art side of photography and videography. Now, if you're looking to buy a secondhand camera, the first thing to look out for is shutter count. And this is more of a photography-esque kind of thing, because for video, shutter count doesn't really matter, but most cameras have a shutter in front of the sensor. And these shutters are quite delicate and are usually the most likely point of failure in a camera. So finding a camera with a very low shutter count may give you a better chance of knowing that that camera is a particular good buy. Now, typically cameras are rated for anywhere between 200,000 to 500,000 actuations. And that doesn't mean that the shutter will stop working after those numbers, so don't be worried about that. But a lower shutter count in the tens of thousands probably means that the camera hasn't been used all that much and that it's got plenty of life left to go. The other thing to look out for is how many owners the camera has been owned by. While it's not always the case, typically the more owners, the more chance of it being a little bit less well looked after in the long run. So, just like cars, watch out for that as well. Otherwise, if a camera has a low shutter count and just a few owners, you've probably got yourself a pretty decent deal. Secondhand cameras can sometimes be 20 or even 50% cheaper than what a brand new camera might cost. And it is a great way to get your very first camera at a lower investment. And also keep an eye out for refurbished or restored cameras from your local retailers as well, because they may have deals where they've fixed up and cleaned cameras from trade-ins or returns and are selling them for cheap as well. All right, on the flip side, now that we've talked about the secondhand market and lower end budget cameras, I know there's a few of you out there who have just a little bit more money and always want to throw themselves headfirst into their hobby and buy the top level stuff straight away, even if they can't use all the features yet, because that's definitely me. For you people, just head straight to the full frame stuff like the Sony a7 Mark IV, which retails for around 2,400 USD. And with that, you'll have a single purchase that you can fully grow into that will last you for the next 10 years and beyond if you look after it right. Okay, with all the money stuff out of the way, let's talk about perhaps the most confusing one of them all, sensor size. So every camera has a sensor inside it. The sensor is the thing that is sensitive to the light and is what is making your exposure or your image. And the bigger the sensor is, the more surface area it has, and therefore the more light it's able to gather because there's more light hitting a bigger surface area. Typically, but not always, that means that the more light it has, the more image quality it potentially has as well. Now, the standard size of a sensor is based around what's called full frame. All of the other sensor sizes are compared to it, and typically the smaller a sensor a camera has, the smaller the actual device itself will be as well. For example, this here is the Sony a7R Mark IV. This is a full frame camera, and it is the biggest one of these three cameras here. This one in the middle is the Sony a6700, and it is an APS-C sized camera, which is 1.5 times smaller than full frame. And then this one here is the Sony RX100, which has a 1-inch sensor, which is around 3 times smaller than full frame. Now I can't open this one up to show you because it is a fixed lens camera, but here is an image of the size comparison. Now, for the context of this discussion and this video, this is kind of all you need to know. And I go way into more detail in my photography fundamentals course if you want to check that out. But for this video, all you need to know is that, as you can see here, the smaller the sensor, the smaller the body, and typically the smaller the lenses that go along with it too. Now, why would you want a larger sensor? Why would you want a full frame sensor? Well, as I alluded to earlier, the larger the sensor size, the more light it's able to gather. And typically that does mean the image quality is better too, because more light will mean you can use a lower ISO value and you have cleaner, more noise-free images with higher dynamic range. However, again, all three of these cameras and sensor sizes are going to have and produce enough, more than enough, sharpness and ISO performance and image quality to make great images, especially in your first few years of hardcore photography or videography. Now, switching gears a bit, one other thing that you may want to consider is how many megapixels your sensor has. The more megapixels your sensor has, the more resolution you have for your image. And this doesn't have a huge bearing for video specifically, and specifically on the lower to mid-range end of things as well, as video resolutions are fixed at HD and 4K, but for photography, it can matter. A standard amount of megapixels is around 24 megapixels, which is twice the amount of your average smartphone. And having more megapixels means that you can crop in and move your composition around in post without as much image degradation. It also means that you can print physically larger images. For example, this a7R Mark IV here with its 61 megapixels can comfortably print around 31.8 inches or 80 centimeters super sharp. However, with AI these days, it's very easy to upscale an image for print, so don't feel like you absolutely need to get all of the megapixels, because you don't. And high megapixel counts don't always mean that the image quality is better. You have to take it as a case-by-case basis, as a camera-by-camera basis. Some sensors are just sharper and resolve more than others. Also, dealing with higher megapixels as well can also be a little bit of a pain. These 61 megapixel files can be over 80 megabytes each, which tends to chew up a very tremendous amount of hard drive space very quickly, which is yet another expense that you have to calculate for. All right, for you video shooters out there, while megapixels aren't going to be a huge deal for you, what is going to be a huge deal is the video format. And in my opinion, in today's world, you are typically going to be looking for something that can shoot in 4K, 24 frames a second as a baseline. Now, this is not only going to give you enough resolution to deliver in high quality landscape orientation, but it's also going to give you the leeway to do vertical crops in video as well. Now at this stage, for the lower to the mid-range stuff, you're going to be looking for 8-bit rather than 10-bit color, which isn't going to be too big of a deal for you right now at the very start of your journey. But something you might want to consider is whether the camera does a little bit of slow-mo as well, because slow-mo is nice and it's a great tool to have in your videography toolkit. Slow-mo means that the camera can shoot in either 60 or 120 frames a second. This is 2.5 times or 5 times slow-mo on a 24p timeline. Typically at the low to mid-range, you're looking about 60 frames per second max, but sometimes some cameras can do 120 frames in HD rather than 4K, which is still going to be a lot of fun and something you probably want to start experimenting with. Also, in this kind of price bracket, stabilization might also be a factor here. So depending on what you're looking to spend for, the mid-tier level stuff tends to come in body stabilization or IBIS, which is going to help tremendously with generating smooth, stable footage. And sometimes cameras don't have IBIS and they have some kind of digital stabilization, meaning that they crop into the sensor just a little bit and digitally manipulate the image so that it appears stable. And this can be a huge help. And it's something that you definitely want to look out for when making that purchase decision. All right, the next group of things to consider here is build. And one of the things I wanted to address here is the type of camera. Now, you may have heard of the term DSLR before. These types of cameras are the traditional model of what people typically think a camera is. These DSLR cameras are an evolution of the traditional film camera, and they have a physical viewfinder, a moving mirror, and a pentaprism inside. The newer version that all camera brands are moving to is called a mirrorless camera. A few years ago, there used to be a debate about where the industry was headed in terms of DSLR versus mirrorless, but things have changed a lot recently, so I won't bore you with the details and the history. In most scenarios, I would recommend purchasing a mirrorless camera, as you're typically going to get the newer features and the newest tech on average. The entire Sony lineup, for example, is purely all mirrorless, and you're only ever going to get DSLRs from other manufacturers. One advantage of buying a DSLR though is that in the second-hand market, they are dead cheap for entry-level DSLRs. So if you want to get into photography or videography super cheap, that's an option for you there. Now, another aspect of the build that is important is the size and the weight. Size and weight is important to consider depending on what kind of photography or videography you're doing. And there are some cameras with a plasticky build that are really light, but not all that durable. And there are cameras that have an all magnesium build that are somewhat weighty and big, but super durable and will last you a very long time. Now, something that people underestimate is the weight of the camera and setup for the type of photography and videography that they're doing. And again, the full frame stuff is going to have full frame sized lenses, which are bigger, heavier, and higher quality. The APS-C stuff is going to have lighter, smaller lenses at a slightly reduced amount of image quality. And anything smaller than that, like this, is going to be super portable and even pocketable with not the best image quality, but definitely good enough for your first few years of shooting, and even for pros like myself. For example, a big, heavy full-frame camera with a full-frame lens setup is going to get you some fantastic results, but hauling around a few kilos around your neck and walking 20,000 steps in a day isn't going to be the most comfortable experience for you. But if you're shooting weddings or you're doing a portrait shoot, then that actually might be totally worth it. I personally own 6 full frame cameras, all the way from the best of the best A1s to the ZVE ones. And I honestly shoot with this RX100 just as much as any of those other cameras, because it's just so easy to carry around and the image quality is excellent. The size of your camera and the size of your lenses change the experience of you going out there and shooting. And you don't want that experience of getting out there and shooting to be a draining one. You want it to be one that is free and fun, and that definition is different for everyone. So make sure that the size and the weight of your setup are a priority in your decision making. Okay, let's talk about perhaps the least important decision when it comes to choosing a camera, in my opinion, and that is brand. Here's the thing. When it comes to image quality and features, almost every camera brand is somewhat on par. It doesn't matter if it's Sony or Canon or Nikon, Fujifilm or Leica, whatever. In today's market, every camera manufacturer makes cameras that are fantastic, especially compared to even just a half decade ago. It really doesn't matter too much what brand you decide to go for, and every single brand will have their own little strengths and weaknesses and little things that they're known for. You know, Leica is known as the over-the-top bougie luxury brand with super high quality builds and eye-wateringly expensive cameras. Fujifilm is known for their attractive retro styling and form factor. You know, Nikon and Canon are known for their DSLR style, bigger form factor cameras, amongst many other things. For me, I choose Sony because I am an ambassador and I love their form factor and their autofocus performance and their expansive lens choices and their dedication to continual improvement in how close they are to user feedback all the time. All the brands are good for their own reasons, and don't get sucked into the fanboyism and elitism and brand wars that people get into, because it's just dumb. You know, when people get riled up about brand, they're expressing their insecurities behind their purchase decisions, but they're missing the point. You know, cameras are just tools, and tools are not what makes a great photographer or videographer. You don't decide to hire a carpenter based on what brand of hammer they decide to use, and you don't judge a creative by what camera they use either. Now, there are only two real considerations to make about brand, in my opinion. The first is that each brand has a very specific way that they mount their lenses. And you can't buy a Sony lens and put it on a Canon body, for example, although you can do it with an adapter the other way around. But for the longevity of your cameras and your purchasing power, choose a brand where you can stick to their lenses for many, many years. I think that is the biggest consideration there. For example, Sony has the E-mount system, and E-mount lenses work on both APS-C bodies and full frame bodies. Now, there are considerations to make here, which I will talk about in a future video specifically about lens choice and purchase decisions around that. But the idea here is that a brand will usually have a mount system that will work specifically for their line of cameras, and they're typically not interchangeable between brands. Now, the other consideration to make about brand is that there might be some advantages around the idea of people who you can actually speak to about that brand. You know, if all of your friends use Sony, it might make it easy for you to talk about and troubleshoot your issues with them, or, you know, swap lenses with them and so on. If your favorite YouTuber uses a particular camera brand, they might talk about it more often, so that you might be able to relate to the things that they might talk about more often as well. Otherwise, especially if it's your first camera or your first few cameras, don't feel obligated to stick with any one brand if you don't want to. All right, that was a lot, and I actually left out quite a few things so that I could focus you in on the things that I think actually matter. And I'm sure along your journey, you'll discover more and more things that matter to you, but for now, this is a great start. So let's wrap everything up here. When deciding on a first camera, consider what you are going to use the camera for. Are you going to do photo? Are you going to do video? Are you going to do both? And then what category of photo or video are you going to be doing, and how might size and weight affect that decision? From there, what kind of budget do you have to spend? You know, are we talking lower to mid-range for under 1,000 USD or secondhand even? Or are we talking about top spec $2,500 USD here? That will decide what sensor size you're going to be able to have, whether that is full frame APS-C or even smaller. Now, what sensor size you have is going to determine the overall size of your kit. full frame is going to come with big, heavy, high quality lenses and a big weight on your bag. APS-C is going to be smaller than that, and the compact stuff is going to even fit in your pocket. That's going to drive your shooting experience based on the style of photography and videography you want to do. So try to look a little bit down the line and purchase something that you're going to be able to grow into, because you're going to be doing a lot of growing. But remember, all of these camera options and camera brands are going to be able to create great photos and great videos for you regardless. So don't feel like you are missing out with one option versus the other. Everyone is in different skill level and financial situations, so you just need to look at your own personal needs and pick something that suits that. All right, let me know if that is helpful, and I'll be in the comments to answer any of your questions you have. And if you want to check out some of the best full frame lenses for Sony cameras, then have a look at this video here and keep researching. All right, I'll see you in the next video, but until then, get out there and make something that matters. Peace.